The dust of the auction square clung to her lips, bitter as the shame she'd swallowed for months. It was the same taste that followed her since the day they lowered her husband's coffin into the earth, and his brother took everything else she owned. Her farm, her mule, her dignity, all gone. She stood at the edge of the crowd now, half woman, half ghost, her belly round with the child that was all she had left of her husband. Folks didn't see a widow anymore. They saw a burden, a mouth to feed, a reminder of death walking among the living. Her brother-in-law had made sure of that, spreading his poison through every corner of the town until even her neighbors turned their faces away. The day was hot and cruel, the kind of heat that made tempers short and hearts mean. In the center of the square, an iron cage sat under the glare of the sun. Inside, a man knelt in chains. He was big, built like the mountains that shadowed the valley, his skin darkened by sun and wind, his back marked by blood-crusted welts. Next to him crouched a boy no older than 6, his small body pressed against his father's side like a frightened pup. The crowd jeered and laughed, hungry for a spectacle. They called the man a savage, a thief, a mountain beast, said he'd been caught poaching on the company's land. To them, he wasn't a man at all, just something wild to mock before supper. The auctioneer, red-faced and sweating through his collar, banged a stick against the cage. "What'll you give for the beast and his pup? Comes as a pair! Good for scaring crows, maybe keeping varmints off your porch." Coins clinked, laughter rang out. It wasn't buying, it was sport. She should have turned away. She should have gone back to her empty cabin and pretended none of it was happening. But when the man raised his head, her breath caught. His eyes weren't wild like the crowd claimed. They were calm, cold, full of a strength she'd never seen in town men. And when his gaze flicked down to the boy trembling beside him, something inside her broke. That child had the same hollow look she saw in her own mirror every morning, the look of someone who had lost everything and learned not to expect kindness from anyone. The auctioneer kept shouting, but the bids slowed. No one wanted to feed 2 mouths, not even for a laugh. He was about to close the sale when she felt her hand move before her mind caught up. She stepped forward. "I'll give this." Her voice barely carried, but the gold band in her palm caught the sunlight. The crowd fell silent. The ring, her wedding ring, was the last thing of value she owned. The auctioneer blinked, then grinned, greed lighting up his face. "Sold! To the widow!" he shouted, slapping his hand on the cage. Murmurs rippled through the square. Her brother-in-law shoved his way through the onlookers, his face twisted in fury. "You've lost your wits, woman? Trading gold for a filthy animal?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. All she knew was that for the first time in months, her heart wasn't numb. It was beating hard and fast and alive. The key was shoved into her hand. The iron cage was rough and cold. Her fingers trembled as she forced the lock open. The man didn't move. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, locked on hers. For a moment, time stretched thin between them, 2 broken souls measuring the distance between fear and trust. Then, without a word, he rose. The boy clung to his hand as they stepped out into the blazing light. The crowd shrank back. No one stopped them. No one dared. She turned toward the dirt trail that wound out of town and started walking. She didn't look behind her, but she could feel their eyes, burning holes through her dress, through her resolve, through every ounce of pride she had left. The sound of footsteps followed, slow and heavy. The man and his son. By the time they reached her cabin at the edge of the foothills, the sun had dropped behind the peaks, leaving the land bathed in fading gold. Her home was little more than a leaning shack, a patch of roof missing, a door barely hanging on. But it was hers, or what was left of it. She turned, expecting the man to vanish into the woods now that he was free, but he didn't. He stood there, looking at the ruin she called shelter. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened when he saw her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. He disappeared into the tree line. Her heart sank. She had given up the only precious thing she had left for a man who would vanish into the dark. Then she heard the sound of breaking branches. He returned with an armful of firewood. Without a word, he knelt by the cold hearth, struck 2 stones, and coaxed a spark into a small flame. The fire grew, painting the cabin walls in shades of orange and life. It was the first warmth she had felt in months, not just from the fire, but from the quiet understanding in his eyes. He didn't owe her. She didn't own him. But in that flicker of light, something unspoken passed between them. The next morning, she woke to the smell of cooked rabbit and the soft sound of the boy's laughter. Thin, shy, but real, the mountain man had been busy. He'd patched the roof with pine shingles and mended the broken door hinge. She stood in the doorway, one hand resting on her belly, watching him move with silent purpose. He worked like a man rebuilding a piece of his soul. For the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel alone. And deep in her heart, though she didn't yet understand it, she knew that the ring she'd given away had bought something far more precious than gold. The mountain wind howled that night, clawing at the cabin walls, but inside there was a fragile warmth, a light that refused to die. She sat near the fire, her hands resting on her swollen belly, watching the man as he carved something small from a piece of pine. The boy slept on a pile of blankets near the hearth, his tiny face peaceful in the flickering glow. She didn't know his name. He hadn't offered it, and she hadn't asked. Words between them were scarce, but none were needed. Each morning he left at dawn and returned by dusk, bringing back rabbits, fish, or bundles of wood. He moved like a man who'd lived his whole life with the earth beneath his feet and the sky as his roof. He never asked for anything, never crossed her space, never raised his voice. Yet every act, patching the roof, mending the fence, splitting logs, spoke louder than any words could. When the first frost arrived, he built a small shelter for the goat she'd once feared would starve come winter. He worked in silence while she stirred stew inside. The boy watched him from a distance, wide-eyed, learning what survival looked like in human form. That night, the wind picked up again. She woke to the sound of dripping water. A leak in the roof had opened right above her straw bed, cold drops splashing on her blanket. She tried to shift away, but the ache in her back stopped her. The baby pressed hard against her ribs, and pain lanced through her sides. She bit her lip and prayed the storm would pass. Then, through the dark, she saw him move. The mountain man rose from his corner near the fire and crossed the room. He didn't say a word. He only climbed onto the table, pressed a piece of bark into the crack, and sealed it with moss and pitch. Water stopped falling. When he climbed down, she saw that his shirt was soaked through, his hair dripping. He went back to his place, sitting quietly until the first light of dawn. She heated what little broth she had left and walked it over to him. He looked up as she held the bowl out. Their eyes met, and for the first time, he spoke. "You are cold," he said simply. It wasn't an apology or a question. It was the truth, an acknowledgement of care. Her heart trembled at the sound of his voice, rough and deep, like gravel rolled by a stream. From that moment, something in the silence between them changed. It softened. Days turned into weeks. The mountain air grew sharper, but the rhythm of their life became steady, almost peaceful. He hunted. She mended. The boy began to hum when she worked in the garden, shyly repeating the tunes she sang. Then one morning she saw the man outside, carving something long and narrow. For hours he worked under the low autumn sun, smoothing the wood with patient hands. The boy fetched tools for him, their quiet bond clear in every glance. When he was done, the man handed the finished piece to the boy. The child carried it to her with both hands, his small face serious. It was a yoke, perfectly shaped to rest across her shoulders with hooks on either end to hold the water buckets. She ran her fingers over the polished surface, stunned. He had noticed her struggling to carry water from the creek. He had seen the pain she tried to hide. Tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, expression unreadable, and turned back to his work. But She saw the faintest flicker of softness cross his face before he looked away. That night, as the fire crackled, she lay awake, listening to the quiet breathing of the boy beside her. She thought of the man across the room, how he carried the scars of some past violence, how he had chosen to build rather than destroy. Her dreams turned dark before dawn. She woke with a scream caught in her throat, the image of her brother-in-law's hand clutching at her baby vivid as the night he'd tried to take her farm. She gasped for breath, clutching her chest. The man was already awake, sitting by the fire. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just stared into the flames. His hands clenched around a small leather pouch that hung from his neck. His eyes looked haunted, as if her nightmare had summoned his own. They didn't talk about it, but in that silence, she understood. He too had known loss, cruelty, helpless rage. Their ghosts lived in the same room now, pacing the same floorboards. After that night, she began to hum more often. Little lullabies her mother had sung when the world felt kinder. The boy would draw near, comforted by the sound. Sometimes, he'd rest his head against her leg while she mended clothes. She would place her hand gently on his hair, and for a moment, they'd both remember what family felt like. But peace on the frontier was a fragile thing. One afternoon, as the last of the snow melted from the hills, a lone rider appeared down the trail. It was an old farmer from the valley, his horse lathered with sweat. He pulled up near the cabin, eyes full of warning. "He's coming," the farmer said. "Your brother-in-law. He's been telling folks you've taken up with a savage, that the baby ain't rightfully yours. He's stirring the sheriff and half the town against you. Says they'll come when the child's born." Her heart froze. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the man stepped from the doorway behind her. His presence filled the space like a rising storm. The quiet caretaker she'd come to know was gone. His eyes turned to steel, his jaw hard as rock. The farmer left, fear driving his horse down the trail. The man began to move with fierce purpose. He nailed boards across the window, reinforced the door, stacked stones on the ridge above the cabin, each motion deliberate, protective. When he handed her a knife, the handle smooth from use, his voice was low. "For you," he said. "Not for them." The weight of the blade in her hand was terrifying and empowering. She met his eyes, and the fear in her chest slowly turned to fire. "They'll come up the ridge," she said quietly. "There's a narrow pass. We can trap them there." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. They spent the next 2 days preparing, setting stones loose above the ravine, marking a hollow log where she and the boy could hide when the time came. The night before the attack, the cabin was quiet. The air felt thick with what was coming. She sat near the fire, her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. The man sat opposite her, sharpening his rifle by the dying glow. Their eyes met for the briefest second. No words, no promises, only understanding. At dawn, they heard it. The sound of hooves, the echo of men who believed they could take what they wanted. The battle for their home had begun. The first gunshots split the mountain's silence. Birds scattered from the pines as a dozen riders thundered toward the cabin. The sheriff rode in front, puffed up with authority he didn't earn, while her brother-in-law trailed close behind, his face twisted in hate and greed. Hidden in the hollow of a fallen log, she clutched the boy to her chest. Every hoofbeat rattled through her bones. The smell of gunpowder drifted faintly through the cold air. She could see through a narrow crack in the bark. The men were riding straight into the ravine, just where they had planned. High above them, the mountain man waited, his rifle steady on a ridge of rock. The wind tugged at his hair as he watched the riders below. He didn't fire yet. He waited. He was patient as the stone beneath him. Then, when the sheriff's horse reached the narrowest point of the trail, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The mountain gave its answer. A cascade of rocks tumbled down from the ridge, striking the ground like thunder. Horses reared and screamed. Men shouted, ducking, cursing. The ravine filled with chaos. It wasn't meant to kill, only to stop them, to show that these mountains wouldn't surrender so easily. The sheriff's hat flew off, and his horse bolted, throwing him into the dirt. But her brother-in-law kept coming. Fury made him blind. He pushed through the panic, stumbling toward the cabin, pistol drawn, spitting curses. She held her breath as he passed the log where she hid. The boy whimpered softly, and she pressed her hand over his mouth, her heart slamming in her chest. Then she saw the mountain man step out from behind a tree near the clearing, rifle in his hands, calm and ready. "Stop!" he said. The word echoed across the clearing like a warning from the earth itself. Her brother-in-law froze, his pistol aimed but trembling. "You got no right to her," he snarled. "No right to that child. That's my kin, not yours." The man didn't move. His voice came quiet, but strong. "You don't own what you destroy." The sheriff and a few shaken men finally reached the clearing, their faces pale as they saw the rifle leveled steady in the mountain man's hands. "She's not safe with you," the sheriff shouted, his bluster cracking. "You're a criminal, a savage. You were in a cage." Before the man could answer, she stepped out from her hiding place, the boy's small hand in hers. The wind tugged at her hair and dress, but she stood tall, every inch of her alive with defiance. "She's safe with him," she said, her voice ringing through the trees. "Safer than she ever was with you." Her brother-in-law turned, startled. "You fool, woman! You think that thing will protect you?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." She took a step closer, holding out something in her hand. It was her husband's old work shirt. Faded, worn, still carrying the faint smell of sweat and cedar. "He gave me this when the winter was cruel," she said. "Because he loved me. You hated him for it. You hated that he had something you never could. Peace." The words hit him like stones. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then the mountain man spoke again, slow and even. "You call me a savage," he said, "but I've seen what men like you do." He pulled off his shirt and turned his back. The crowd gasped. The scars there told a story no words could. Long, twisted ridges of white and red, crisscrossing like the map of every cruelty he'd survived. "This," he said, his voice cracking, "is what your kind does when they find someone different. They cage what they fear. They burn what they don't understand." Silence fell heavy as snowfall. One of the farmers lowered his rifle, then another. The truth in the man's voice stripped away all pretense of righteousness. The sheriff looked around, realizing his men were no longer with him. The old farmer who had warned them rode into the clearing, his gray beard wet with morning mist. "He's right," the farmer said, pointing at her brother-in-law. "This man's been lying to you all. Told everyone his brother's land was worthless. I offered fair coin for it, but he wanted more. He wanted to own what he didn't earn." Murmurs spread through the group. Shame replaced fury. The sheriff lowered his eyes, then turned his horse and rode away without a word. One by one, the rest followed, leaving only her brother-in-law standing in the clearing, small, defeated, exposed. He looked at her, eyes full of rage and fear, then spat in the dirt and stumbled down the trail, disappearing into the trees. When he was gone, the only sound left was the wind. It no longer howled. It sighed, soft, almost gentle. She turned to the man. His shoulders sagged, the rifle hanging loose in his grip. He looked tired, but in his eyes there was peace. "It's over," she whispered. He nodded once, for now. Weeks passed. Winter melted into a tender spring. Wildflowers covered the hill behind the cabin, and the air smelled of pine and new beginnings. She gave birth on a quiet afternoon, sunlight slanting through the patched window. The mountain man boiled water, his big hands shaking as he did everything she told him. When the baby cried, the sound filled the cabin like a blessing. A girl. She had her mother's eyes and her father's dark hair. The boy hovered nearby, his face glowing with wonder. When she placed the baby in his arms, his small fingers trembled as he held her close. For the first time since she'd met him, the boy smiled, a full, honest smile that lit up the room. Later, as the sun sank behind the ridge, the man sat on the porch carving something small. She joined him, the baby in her arms, the boy curled at her knee. When he finished, he handed her a tiny wooden bird, with its wings spread wide. "For her," he said softly. She smiled, tears in her eyes. "You made this?" Quote. He nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "It's a good home," he said. She looked at the cabin, the repaired roof, the garden blooming again, the firelight flickering through the window, and then at him. "It is," she whispered. "It's home because we built it together." He reached into his pocket and handed her a small stone, smooth from years in the river. Etched into its surface was a carving, 4 figures holding hands, a man, a woman, a boy, and a baby. She traced the lines with her thumb, her heart full. It wasn't a ring of gold, but it was something greater. A promise, not of ownership, but of belonging. That night, the mountain wind was gentle, carrying the sound of a baby's soft breathing and the steady rhythm of a man's hands, carving hope out of wood. And though no one in town would ever speak of it again, the people who had once mocked her would never forget the day a broken widow bought a caged man. And together, they rebuilt something the whole town had lost. They rebuilt love,